Hello, this is Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Yinka Yetade. Coming up in this edition, nearly 3 weeks on from their seizure of Goma, M23 rebels continue their advance to the city of Bukavu, the group claiming to have taken control of the city's Kamuvu airport. Meanwhile, President Felix Tshisekedi doubling down on his call for Rwanda to face sanctions over its alleged support of M23. The conflict high on the agenda for the Africa Union summit this weekend. The heads of the 55 member states from across the continent gathering in Addis Ababa to thrash out fresh solutions to end the fighting. From invasive bugs to toxic pesticides, Kenya's roses are facing some thorny issues this Valentine's Day. Over a third of the flowers in the EU have their roots in the East African country. Welcome to the program. We're going to start with the latest on the conflict in eastern DRC. M23 rebels backed by Rwanda are continuing their march in South Kivu province after capturing Goma. While adding to their gains, local sources say the group has seized a strategic airport. Meanwhile, the UN is continuing to sound the alarm over the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Eastern Congo. Fighting there has left 350,000 internally displaced people without shelter. Emmett Livingstone reports now from Kinshasa.
Rwanda-backed M23 rebels on Friday claimed control of the strategic airport of Kavumu, according to local as well as security sources. The armed group's spokesperson also said as much on the social media platform X. A senior Congolese military official gave a slightly different account, saying that there was fighting near the airport, without confirming that it had fallen. It's bad news in any case for Congolese forces. Kavumu is an important military airport, and it's where the shattered remains of the country's forces had assembled after the rebels captured the city of Goma some 3 weeks ago. Kavumu is also considered the very last bastion of defence before the city of Bukavu, which is the second largest in eastern Congo. It's about 20 kilometres from the city. There are very real fears that the rebels will march imminently on Bukavu. City residents saw soldiers retreating towards Bukavu on Friday. South Kivu's governor, for his part, has convened an urgent security meeting, and residents are taking cover indoors. Leaders from East and Southern Africa gathered at a crisis summit last week and called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, which appears to be being ignored.
Well, President Tshisekedi is doubling down on his call for his Rwandan counterpart to face international sanctions over his alleged support for M23 rebels. Tshisekedi made the appeal at the Munich Security Conference this Friday, where he denounced Paul Kagame's, quote, expansionist ambitions in the DRC and called for him to be blacklisted.
The integrity of a country be violated like this. Its people massacred without the country responsible being sanctioned. This raises the question of the United Nations, which for me has become a two-tier organization, depending on whether you are among the powerful or privileged countries or whether you are among the weak and disadvantaged.
Well, Tshisekedi says he won't attend this weekend's Africa Union summit. Finding fresh solutions to the conflict in eastern DRC is high on the agenda for the meeting. The heads of member states from across the continent will be gathering in Addis Ababa for the 38th edition of the summit. Chances for a breakthrough during the meeting are slim as M23 rebels advance in the region. Meanwhile, Rwanda's leader, accused of backing them, has vowed to, quote, spit in the face of anyone punishing him for his actions. Well, let's get some analysis on this now and bring in Desiree Sogbavi, who is a political analyst, and he joins us now from Addis Ababa. Great to have you on the program, Desiree. Thank you so much for joining us. So we know that there's been an emergency meeting today ahead of the summits this weekend. Tshisekedi wasn't there, but he is pointing the finger at Rwanda, and he's calling again for those sanctions against Paul Kagame. Do you see that happening?
Unfortunately, we haven't seen much progress so far. As you said, conflicts situations are very high on the agenda of the summit that is happening now. And as we are speaking, the Peace and Security Councils of the African Union have just have their meeting. we are expecting more pressure from African head of states on the protagonist of the conflict. On our view, there is no military solution possible for that conflict in the DRC. It is important that pressure amounts on all the protagonists to go back to the negotiation table. Unfortunately, it's not happened yet, and we are expecting this summit, even beside the meeting of the Peace and Security Council of the Union that happened today, we are expecting that the whole assembly of the Union, composed of all member states, will be able to exert much pressure on all the players within that conflict.
So do you think that pressure will be a game changer? Do you see this summit really being where a breakthrough happens in terms of stopping the conflict in the DRC?
It is our hope anyway. And more we have head of states or countries of the continent speaking in one voice, towards those protagonists, the player of the conflict, there's a hope that they might listen, because in any way they're going to need, their peers of the continent, to support them. It is important to insist on the importance of negotiations, and there is no military solution possible. But it is also important to mention that whoever around the world, all partners of Africa who could have any influence on the protagonists of the conflict should come in the game. Again, we are expecting and we are calling for local solutions, but it is important that all kind of solutions are envisaged, including solutions coming outside of the continent.
Well, Desiree, you mentioned that you were part of those discussions today, just ahead of the start of the summit this weekend. Give us a feel of what we can expect from the summit.
So basically, by tomorrow, we are expecting that the communique or the decisions out of the Peace and Security Council will be out. And we are expecting maybe a feedback from the protagonists of the conflict, to react. It is also important to mention that at this summit, the African Union is going to elect the new leadership. And it is expected that at the level of the Union, the president of Angola might become the chairperson of the African Union. And because he's already involved in the conflict, we are expecting that he'll be able to continue the process, the talk that he has started on behalf of the African Union, together with what we call Nairobi process with President Ruto, to exert more and more pressure on the protagonist. So we are expecting that out of this summit, something positive might come out.
Desiree, thank you so much for joining us on the program. It was great to get your insight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, shifting gears now, the fallout from President Donald Trump's move to put a funding freeze on the U.S. Agency for International Development continues. Nigeria is trying to cushion the blow. Lawmakers today approved an additional $200 million for the health sector as part of its 2025 spending plan. The most populous country in Africa was among the top 10 recipients of aid from the U.S. Well, France 24's Mark Perelman has been speaking to Winnie Banyima, the Executive Director of UNAIDS, about the wider impact of the shutdown of USAID.
We, UNAIDS, have estimated, having looked at the impacts on the ground and looking at the figures that we monitor, that if the support the United States government has been putting in is not replaced, we already have 630,000 deaths last year, but we could have 6.3 million more deaths in the next 5 years. There are 20 million people who are alive today because they are swallowing some tablets every day and coming directly from funding of the United States government. If we do not quickly find a way to fill this gap, they could die. But let me say this also, it wasn't normal and it was very risky to depend so heavily on one country. New innovations new treatments for prevention in particular have come online, are already being rolled out in the rich countries, and we were making plans to have them rolled out in Africa and other developing countries. An injectable that can be applied twice a year, an injection twice a year, has 100% efficiency in protecting people from being infected. Girls and young women in Africa are the most infected. With this injection, we could reduce new infections to zero. We could be on our way to ending AIDS. So we keep saying to the American government, this is not the time to pull out. This is the time to stay and get your company, Gilead, which is the innovator here, to roll out, to make its huge profits on new treatments, new prevention tools, and end AIDS.
Shifting gears now, Cupid is on his worldwide love tour for Valentine's Day. Well, if you're celebrating, you've probably been gifted or received a rose. Well, much of the flowers exchanged around the world for Valentine's Day actually have their roots in Kenya. The country's roses are prized for their longevity and vase performance. But the key export has been hit by some thorny issues, as Clement Swallow explains.
These roses may be red, but Kenya's flower industry is feeling a little blue. These symbols of romance, which make up around 66% of the country's flower exports, are now facing a pest control problem. Inside the rosebuds, a tiny larva can be found, laid by the false codling moth, an insect which doesn't just feed on the iconic flowers, but also ravages crops. As a result, the European Union is intensifying measures to prevent its spread across Europe, which Kenyan producers say are having a negative impact on their businesses.
They are too strict, and most of the time our shipments to EU are quarantined. We have to meet the demand for the customers in time. So we are looking for alternative markets where these measures are not too strict, because we end up losing 30% of revenue.
And the moth is not the only challenge that Kenyan farmers are facing. The use of pesticides to minimize losses is also generating pushback from the EU, which imports over 30% of the country's cut roses. A 2020 study by the Route to Food Initiative found that nearly half the pesticides permitted in Kenya are banned across the bloc. Farmers who want to export to Europe have to stay within the bloc's pesticide regulations while also trying to control the moth populations.
We are having a tough times to monitor the regulations and the rules of the EU. With the weather conditions now, we have to use that, otherwise we will not manage to get our production what we are targeting.
Despite existing stringent protocols, the EU is expected to enforce even tougher restrictions in the coming months.
Well, that's it from all of us on the Eye on Africa team. Thanks so much for your company and stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on France 24.